of things open space and trails and wildlife related. And so we try to do these speaker series together, and we thank them for all that support. Maddie Guzman is here. She's on our open space and trail staff. She's our analyst and helps to set up the details for this event. Jake Ivan is here. He is a wildlife researcher with Colorado Parks and Wildlife, and tonight he'll be speaking about Wolverine restoration. So just a little background on the Wolverine. He will go into much more detail. The North American Wolverine is a species that is native to Colorado, but was extirpated, and that's a big word in my mind for killed off, from the state in the early 1900s. Colorado Parks and Wildlife, and we'll refer to Colorado Parks and Wildlife as CPW throughout the presentation. They initiated a plan to restore this species in our state in the late 1990s, but it was kind of put on hold for a while so that they could address the Canada lynx. Within the past few months, legislation was passed authorizing CPW to pick up this goal to reintroduce wolverines again to Colorado. So the presentation will cover basic wolverine ecology, why CPW thinks restoring the species is a good thing for Colorado, and how such a process could work and next steps towards achieving the goal. As far as Jake's biography, it's very impressive. He has a BS from Purdue University in wildlife science, an MS in wildlife biology from the University of Montana, and a PhD in fish and wildlife and conservation biology from CSU. In past lives, he has worked for the Nature Conservancy and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service before he became part of the Mammals Research Group at CPW, and he's been doing work with CPW for about 14 years. At CPW, he's worked largely on conservation and management issues related to Canada lynx and snowshoe hares, and how forest management and bark beetles impact both species. Some interesting fact about Jake: he grew up in Michigan and is a lifelong fan of the University of Michigan Wolverines. So there's a connection there. As such, all of his early childhood animal reports in grade school were about wolverines. So it's kind of funny how life comes full circle for us in many ways. Here we are 40 years later, and he's still talking about wolverines. So with that, I'll turn it over to Jake. And for our attendees, I just want to let you know, we'll try to hold most questions until the end. And if you have a question, just use the chat or the Q&A, and Tara will help us through the questions. So with that, Jake, I'll turn it over to you. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you, Kristen, for the introduction. That was great. Thanks for the opportunity to be here tonight. Happy to talk about wolverines. This is a super fun subject. So I love giving this talk, and I hope you enjoy it as well. So let's see if I can get this. I'll share it up to you guys correctly. And hopefully you're seeing the title slide, correct?
Yes, looks good.
Okay, sounds good. So as Kristen mentioned, what we're going to be talking about tonight is broadly wolverine restoration in Colorado, and I kind of have the talk split into some various segments here. First and foremost, I want to talk a bit about wolverine biology, ecology, natural history, so we're all on the same page as in terms of what this species is and how it operates in the world. A bit about its history in Colorado and why we think restoring wolverines to the state is a good idea. Then we'll get into some technical aspects of reintroduction, what we expect that to look like, or at least are planning on that to look like. And then I wanted to follow up with just a summary of recent events, give you a quick rundown of that Senate bill that just passed this last session, what that means and what that requires of us and what the next steps are. One of the biggest steps being this 10J designation, and we'll talk about that and why that's important and what that means as well. So anyway, let's dive into wolverines. So this is the species of interest. Wolverines are a weasel. They're actually the world's largest terrestrial weasel species. So they weigh in between 15 and 40 pounds usually. They live a very solitary existence, very territorial. They defend their territories from other members of the same sex very strongly. And they maintain just absolutely huge territories, especially when you consider their body size. So when we compare them to other species of a similar weight, such as bobcats or coyotes, Wolverine territories tend to be upwards of 20 times the size of a bobcat or coyote territory. Even things like Canada lynx, which we think of as having very large home ranges themselves, a Wolverine is a territory is about 8 times that of a Canada lynx. So the take home I want you to get from this first slide is that because they are solitary and very territorial and defend those territories strongly, and those territories are so huge, that this is a species that exists at very low densities and they're just naturally rare, even in parts of the world where they're doing quite well and their populations are very stable. That's just kind of how they roll as a species. So what we're looking at here is a map of historical Wolverine distribution across the world. They have what we term circumpolar distribution. So it runs from, let's see if I can get my pointer up here. So it runs from Scandinavia all the way across high latitudes in Russia into Alaska, all the way across Canada. And importantly for us, the historical range did dip down into the Rocky Mountains all the way into almost Colorado here historically. So as you might imagine, given that that is their range, this is a species that is very well adapted to cold and snowy environments. So they're very adept at exploiting those places in a number of different ways. Maybe the most important ways is they they use that cold and snow in their environment to store food. And we'll talk about, what they eat in the next couple of slides here. But a lot of times they're storing things for later by burying it in the snow and sort of using nature's refrigerator to help them cache food for later. And it's also incredibly important for denning. So most of the world's dens are found in places that have deep snow that extends well into the spring period. This is actually a picture of a den site, very typical in this avalanche chute. And you can see there's tracks in the snow here and they lead up under this tree or this old snag. And down there, several feet down under the snow is where a den was located for this female. It serves to keep the kits warm, help them thermoregulate when it's cold outside, and also protect them from other wolverines and also other predator species that may be in the area. So what do these guys eat? Wolverines are widely known for being incredibly efficient scavengers. Okay, so most of the time in most places, um, for most of the season, what they do is they roam that huge territory. They can cover a lot of ground in a hurry. They have an incredible sense of smell. And what they're doing is looking for stuff that's already dead. And they're going to try to, whittle off whatever they can from any of these carcasses, and they sort of eke out a living, based on scavenging, carrion and things that have already died due to disease, other predators, avalanches, et cetera, et cetera. So for the most part, that's what they do. In some parts of the world, and we would expect this in Colorado as well, they do change their diet substantially in the summer to more active predation. And most of what they go after are kind of small to medium-sized rodents like the yellow-bellied marmot you see here. So they spend a lot of the summer in other places in the Rockies, hunting these guys. And that's what provides the calories to female that gets them through the kit rearing stage, which is incredibly energetically taxing for them. But as soon as summer is over and the marmots go back into hibernation and they're back to, roaming around and looking for dead stuff again. In terms of their reproductive biology, wolverines breed during the summer. They exhibit this phenomenon known as delayed implantation, which is very similar to bears, if you're familiar with that species. What that means is that the sperm fertilizes the egg in the summer, but then it just sort of sits there suspended and does nothing until the following winter, and then it finally implants into the uterine wall and begins to develop. They actually have a very short gestation period. um, just like 30, 40 days. And the bursts then occur mostly in the dead of winter in February or March. Litter sizes vary between 2 and 4 on average, and females generally only breed about every other year. Okay, so this is not a super fecund, super productive species. They're definitely not rabbits. Their population dynamics, their growth rates are relatively slow and methodical through time. This last bullet is pretty important. This has to do with dispersal patterns in this species. And what we see is that it's very different between the sexes. So young female kits tend to not disperse very far, and their preference is to establish a home range, if they can, right next to their mom. Uh, Males are exactly the opposite. So they can and do and will disperse quite far, hundreds and hundreds of kilometers to establish a new territory elsewhere. So very different patterns there between the two sexes in terms of dispersal. And again, remember that because that'll come up later in the next couple of slides. Okay, so there's your quick introduction to Wolverine biology and ecology. Let's pivot for a second and talk a little bit about the history of this species in Colorado. As Kristen mentioned, this is a species that is native to the state. It did occur here historically. So what I'm showing you in this slide is a figure that Keith Aubrey and others put together in a 2007 publication. What these guys did is went through the painstaking process of reviewing museum records of wolverines from all museums in North America. They reviewed old trapping records, old trapping logs, government trapping records, et cetera, tried to pull out the things that seemed plausible as actual wolverine observations, and then plotted those on a map. So what you're seeing here is all historical wolverine locations they could come up with for the period 1827 to 1960. And as you can see, there's a number of these black dots in Colorado. They all occur in the western slope, kind of up in the high country where you know, would expect them to occur. So wolverines certainly were here historically. As Kristen mentioned, there's a big E word. They were extirpated in 1919. We think the main reason for that, we don't know for sure, was probably unregulated trapping in combination with widespread predator poisoning campaigns. So both of those activities were pretty common in the late 1800s and early 1900s before we formed wildlife agencies and made rules and started regulating, you know, hunting and trapping and that sort of stuff. Um, they're very susceptible to both, especially poisoning, because they are so good at scavenging. Um, that it's very easy to lace carcasses with poison and get wolverines to come to it. They will find it, and then you know they're very easily poisoned in that way. Excuse me. They were listed as state endangered in 1973. They still remain state endangered in Colorado. Um, our agency, or our predecessor, the Division of Wildlife, conducted 12 surveys from 1979 to 1996, looking specifically for any sign of presence of both Canada lynx and wolverines, and didn't come up with much of anything on any of those surveys. So it's CPW is of the mind that the species is still extirpated. There may be, you know, the odd individual wandered into Colorado here and there, but there certainly is no breeding population, and that's borne out in the second figure from that same publication. Now these guys are plotting known wolverine locations from 95 to 2005, and you can see now Colorado is just a big blank spot on the map here. So let's talk about why we think restoring wolverines to Colorado might actually be a pretty good idea. So what I'm showing you here is the Western United States. And all of the green polygons are modeled wolverine habitat for the contiguous US. Okay. That's from a model that was built in 2013. So it's getting to be a little bit old now, but that's still the latest and greatest and best depiction that we have. The blue polygon is the approximate current distribution of wolverines in the lower 48. So this we have a very good handle on because all of these Western states got together several years ago and began organizing and participating in collaborative Wolverine surveys in every state in the same year using the same methods and all of that kind of thing. And this is where we know all of our current Wolverine detections to be, is under these light blue polygons. So they basically have repopulated the United States from Canada starting in the 30s, moved down into the northern Rockies and central Idaho, and have made it into the greater Yellowstone area and down into the Wind River Range. And then also more recently have come down the Cascades, even into central and southern Washington as well. So a couple of things to note from this map. First of all, is there are a lot of pretty large green polygons here in Colorado, right? In fact, Colorado contains the largest remaining block of unoccupied habitat in the lower 48. And if you do the math on all of those blocks, we actually have about a fifth of the estimated capacity in the Western US. So we have a lot of potential here to do good things and provide good habitat and a good home for a Wolverine population, except that our habitat is, currently empty. The other thing that you'll notice is that all of this habitat in Colorado is isolated by the red desert here and I-80 and all that sagebrush from the next largest occupied block of habitat in Northwest Wyoming. And we think that's a bit problematic. We know that at least one male Wolverine, young male, dispersed from the Tetons, made it down into Colorado about a decade ago now. So that is possible. It can happen. We don't think that that happens very often. But the other thing we're really worried about that seems like a very low probability event, if you remember back to what I told you about female dispersal, the young females don't like to make that trek, or very unlikely to make that trek at all. If they can, they're going to try to squeeze in right next to their mom up here in areas where there's lots of other Wolverines around. So we think it's a very low probability event that a female might make it down here just via natural dispersal event. Of course, it's also a low probability event that a male would make the same trek. It's even lower probability event that the two sexes, one individual from each sex, would make that trek at the exact same time and find each other. And even if we were lucky enough for all of that to happen, now you're starting, a potential new population with a population size of 2, which is a terrible place to be in terms of inbreeding depression and stochastic events and all of those sorts of things. So we think we have a lot of potential here. We could do a lot of good things for conservation and restoration of the species, which is now federally threatened. It's about exactly a year ago that it was listed as threatened in the lower 48. So we have a lot of potential. We also don't think that natural dispersal is as likely to establish a population down here anytime soon, at least. And so we think that they need some assistance from us. So what we're doing or hoping is to restore this population via a planned reintroduction of Wolverines from further north. So a logical question then, given that that's what we want to do, is how many Wolverines do we think Colorado can hold? We have a lot of habitat, but is that, it would be a lot of work and a lot of time and a lot of effort. Is it going to be worth it? If we do establish a population, will that, really help things? And it turns out, I won't go through all of the details. We have a restoration plan that is done. It's at the printers. It will be available to the public, I think, in a few months, probably. But we went through several different flavors of exercise to try to estimate this. All of these were variations on taking all of those green chunks of habitat and assuming, a home range size of a Wolverine on average is going to be whatever it's going to be, and dividing those two things out and figuring out if you packed all the Wolverines into those green blobs as tightly as you could, how many could you fit? And it turns out the answer is somewhere between 100 and 180-ish. That may be a bit on the high side because that habitat model was built in 2013. As you know, we've had some pretty large wildfires rip through Colorado since then, so probably not all of that mapped habitat is actually habitat There's other places that are mapped that are now pretty heavily recreated, have a pretty substantial human footprint that may not be habitat, but this gives us a starting point at least, maybe a top end, but a rough range of what we can expect. So 140-ish individuals, which doesn't sound like much, and honestly, it isn't much. But again, remember that this is a species that just naturally occurs at very low densities and is naturally rare. And for wolverines, 140 is actually a fairly substantial thing. If we could put 140 here, we think the best estimates we have for all of the lower 48 currently are 300 to 400. That would be a pretty big boost to that lower 48 population. So if we're able to get this done, if we're successful, what would the benefits be of having wolverines back in Colorado? The first thing, and maybe the most important thing for us as Colorado Parks and Wildlife, is we would be restoring a native species to its historical range. You know, bullet 1A in our mission statement is to manage and perpetuate native species in the state. And this is a native species. It has been extirpated due to human activity. It's sort of our mission as written out in black and white, if we can, to try to put them back. So first and foremost, that's our biggest reason for trying to do this. The other thing, as I just mentioned in the previous slide, is in a larger sense, this is a federally threatened species. There are a fair number of conservation concerns, as you might imagine, for a snow-adapted species with climate change. What does the future look like? If we were to establish a population here, we could potentially boost the population size in the lower 48 by 20% or maybe even more, which would be huge. That would improve what the Fish and Wildlife Service refers to as the 3 Rs: redundancy, resilience, and representation of a population, or distinct population segment is what they call that. I won't go into what each of those are. There's a lot of details there, but just know that these are the metrics the Fish and Wildlife Service focuses on for conservation and focuses on for consultation and listing decisions. And when we could really improve the status of each of these categories by reestablishing a population here. One thing I haven't really talked about that would be a big benefit to the lower 48 as well is improving the genetic diversity of the distinct population segment here. Obviously, just having more animals in a separate population in another place is desirable. But also, we have the opportunity to be strategic, potentially, about where we bring animals in from, and we could potentially choose animals from populations that have a higher degree of diversity, or choose to bring them in from 2 or 3 different places to create our own diversity. And that would really help things looking into the future as well. And maybe the most important point that I haven't discussed yet at all is we would be, again, if we are successful in this and it moves forward, establishing a population in what looks to be, in some sense, a potential climate refugium. And what I mean by that is that obviously climate change is happening. We are not going to escape it. No one's going to escape it. But the high country in Colorado is projected to weather climate change better than other parts of current Wolverine range. And that's all due 100% to our elevation, basically. So it's a little counterintuitive because we sit at the very, very southern tip of Wolverine range in North America. So you would think that climate change in a southern tip is, probably not a good thing. But because of that elevation, we are projected to stay colder for longer, snowier for longer than, say, Northwest Montana, the Cascades, Central Idaho, et cetera. So having a population here, we think would be a good thing, and spread that risk of climate change out over more places and get them in places that might do relatively better. All right, so let's pivot again here and talk about some of the proposed technical aspects of what a reintroduction might look like. And again, there's a lot more detail than this that's written out in the plan. That plan will be made public. You'll be able to download it and read all the details you want. One disclaimer I would put on all of this, though, is this is a plan. and we all know about best laid plans and how those things tend to go. We've done our due diligence. We've planned it out, I think, as well as we can plan it out. But literally no entity in the world has ever attempted a Wolverine reintroduction. We would be the first to try it. And of course, given that you're the first to do anything, there are bound to be mistakes and stops and starts and things that don't go according to plan. But anyway, this is the plan on, on paper, at least. As Kristen mentioned, I did want to reiterate that this is not a new idea for our agency. We have been thinking about restoring Wolverines to Colorado for some decades. In fact, if you go back to January of 1998, you can find old copies of this draft strategy for the conservation and reestablishment of lynx and wolverines in the Southern Rocky Mountains. Okay, so several decades earlier, we were planning to do both species at the same time, then had sort of an attack of reality of how difficult that might be, decided to do one and then the other, and decided to do Canada lynx first. So that's what we sort of bit off. First, we reintroduced Canada lynx from 99 to 2006, continued to monitor them through 2010. And that's when all of the data we collected sort of pointed to the fact that we thought we had a self-sustaining and viable population of lynx in the state. And that's when we sort of halted those reintroduction efforts and had some press releases declaring the lynx reintroduction to be a success. Immediately following that, we turned our attention back toward wolverines. So in 2010, same year, we invited a group of Wolverine experts, literally from all over the world, to Fort Collins for a 2-day workshop. And what we did is put all of those heads together and actually came up with this publication. It was all of their best thoughts, best guesses, best ideas as to how one might go about restoring and translocating wolverines and monitoring them post-release. Again, no one has done this, so we don't know for sure how well these ideas might work, but we thought getting all of the folks that know something about wolverines from all over the world together and seeing what they thought was the best that we could do and would be a good starting point. So a lot of what I'm going to present to you next and most of the details in the plan sort of follow from the thoughts and ideas from this working group here. We also adhered to, I will mention to, the IUCN has international guidelines and best practices for reintroductions. And of course, we have tried to follow those at every step of the way as well. So one of the first things to figure out is the numbers game. Like, how many wolverines should you translocate to try to create a new population? And one thing that became very clear is nobody in the room thought that if we think we can fit 100 Wolverines in Colorado, that we necessarily have to move 100 of them down here. That's probably not necessary. It would be incredibly expensive and time consuming and potentially hard on the source populations that you would get them from. And so the question is, well, what is an optimal number? And that group embarked on what's known as a PVA, or a population viability analysis, which is a fancy term of just running a whole bunch of simulations on the computer, assuming different scenarios. What if we reintroduce this many and the survival rate is this and the reproductive rate is this and the probability of something bad happening in terms of wildfire is X in any given year? What does that population projection look like? And if we tweak that and say, well, what if we did this many animals instead? What does that projection look like? And you can play all those games over and over and over again. And what that analysis, the sort of the final answer there suggested is that we should probably, at a minimum, try to translocate 30 individuals. Okay, so 20 females, 10 males. This was reflective of sort of the natural sex ratios that we find in nature. There's usually twice as many females as males out there. That would be the minimum number necessary to reintroduce over 2 years to produce a population that has a pretty good chance of growing and a pretty small chance of declining to extinction. Given that, what we have written out in the plan is we suggested targeting 45 individuals, so 30 males, 15, or 30 females, 15 males, over 3 years if we can get our hands on that many Wolverines. And the whole idea there is to not shoot for the minimum, but to give ourselves a little bit of a buffer, a little bit of insurance in case all of the things that we assumed in those simulations, vital rates and things like that don't match what we observe in Colorado, or, heaven forbid, all of the computer exercises don't match what actually happens in nature, which is probably true. So, and to just try to account for any unanticipated issues that might arise. So giving ourselves a little buffer, 15 animals per year over 3 years is what we're shooting for. The next question is, where broadly would you put them? So to address that, what we did is now I've zoomed down into Colorado. The green polygons in the background there is the mapped Wolverine habitat, same green polygons that I showed you earlier from that west-wide look at Wolverine habitat. And what we did is we overlaid the biggest green, most contiguous green polygons with a series of hexagons. And those hexagons are snapped to the home range size, what we anticipate to be the home range size of a female. Okay, I'll talk about that more in a second. And then what we did is just collapse or dissolve those polygons into three big areas that we're calling release zones. So there's this tan release zone up here. These are all about the same size. The northern release zone occurs north of I-70. There's a central release zone between 70 and 50 in here in yellow. And then the San Juans down here in brown is our southern release zone. Okay, so those are places where we generally, at a broad scale, want to translocate animals. And again, as I mentioned, the idea would be to get a hold of 15 animals per year, put 15 in one release zone, probably start with the central. And then the next year, get a new 15 and put those in a different release zone. And then the next year, get another 15 and put those in the remaining release zone. Now, obviously, when we put animals on the ground, they are not going to care at all about our stupid little hexagons and where we've drawn those lines. And so this is sort of a way for us to conceptualize what might happen and how it might go. But clearly, after we put the first animal on the ground, we're probably going to have to pivot and adjust and figure out where the other animals should go from there. But this is kind of the idea, at least. We have thought a lot about where to get these individuals from. They probably will not come from any of that light blue polygon that I showed in one of those earlier slides. The entire population in the lower 48 is now federally threatened. Doesn't seem like a good idea to try to remove animals from a population that's already sort of on the brink of being, federally endangered and not doing well from a conservation standpoint. So I think Montana, Idaho, Wyoming, Washington, those states are probably out of the picture in terms of sources. We would go further north from there. There are a number of things to consider. One of the first big issues that we thought about was trying to prioritize getting individuals from areas that are ecologically similar to Colorado. And what I mean by that is Wolverine Range covers a very diverse set of landscapes and cover types in North America. So for instance, Wolverines live in places that are mountainous and covered with trees like Colorado. They also live in treeless tundra in the Arctic as well. So all things being equal, we would prioritize trying to get individuals from places that look like Colorado. So they know what mountains are, they know what trees look like, those sorts of things. Mortality sources was a big consideration as well. There aren't a whole lot of things out there that can take out a Wolverine, but cougars are one of those things. We certainly have a robust cougar population here in Colorado, but cougars are not present everywhere in North America that Wolverines are present. So again, all things being equal, if we could snap our fingers and get Wolverines from anywhere we wanted, we would probably try to get them from places where they know what a cougar is and have dealt with that other species, potential predator their whole lives. Similar story for food sources. As I mentioned earlier, we expect marmots to be a pretty important food source for Wolverines. If we are able to restore a population here. In the same story, lots of places in uh, Montane, Canada, and Alaska have marmots or something similar. There are a lot of places that don't have anything like that. So all things being equal, we would try to get individuals from places where they knew what a marmot was and they knew how to hunt them. The other big consideration was genetics. And the consideration here is simply genetic diversity, or the technical term, what people refer to as heterozygosity. And the reason for this is we will necessarily be starting with a pretty small population, 30 to 45 individuals, which is not large. And as you might imagine, or you have heard, one of the perils of being in a small population is inbreeding and inbreeding depression. And if that sets in, that can mean bad things for your population. And the way that you combat that, try to insulate yourself from that, is to start with a population that's as genetically diverse as you can reasonably make it. So we have heterozygosity estimates from all of the various populations in North America. Again, if we could cherry pick, we'd probably pick individuals from those that are most diverse, or pick individuals from multiple populations to create diversity that way. But this is the real world. We probably won't be able to cherry pick just whatever we want based on biology. Certainly, political and logistical considerations will play a huge role, as we've already seen if you followed the wolf reintroduction stuff. And none of those things have been evaluated or vetted or talked about at all yet. We do believe that we can likely establish and restore a population here with wolverines from most anywhere, but we do think that the probability of that happening goes up if we are able to address some of these biological considerations here. All right, so the mechanics of how this might work, very broadly, I think we would sort of like to hit rewind and replay on what we did with the Canada lynx reintroduction. The way that unrolled is we just leveraged trapping seasons and the trappers in those source states or provinces. Okay, so most of the Canadian provinces and Alaska have a regular trapping season that includes wolverines from November to January. There are lots and lots and lots of folks up there that have trapped wolverine for years and years and years, and they're very good at it and they know what they're doing. What we did for lynx is we just got hooked in with some of those trapper associations and made a deal. And what we said is, if you can trap a lynx and keep it alive, we will pay you a lot more money for a live lynx than you were ever going to get by selling that pelt. And so in our mind, this is kind of a triple win situation. We then get individuals that we want for restoration with relatively little effort on our part. The trappers get to make a lot more money than they ever would have otherwise from their hobby. And then from an individual wolverine perspective, they get a second lease on life, albeit in a different part of the world, but probably better than being sold as a pelt. So that's how we hope to get them here. The idea would then bring those individuals into Colorado and hold them at our Frisco Creek Wildlife Rehabilitation Center. This is down by Del Norte. That facility was built in the late 90s for lynx and wolverine reintroductions specifically. Okay, so that's where all of the lynx were held before we rolled them out, but we also engineered that thing to hold wolverines, because remember, at that time we were thinking of doing both. So we already have a facility that was built to hold individuals and to hold up to wolverines. They can be pretty feisty. And while there, those individuals would be subjected to various exams, medical treatments if they needed it, fitted with GPS collars. That's how we will obtain much of the data that we need to be able to track how well the restoration is going. We would also like to, if we can, do some ultrasounds, see if we can figure out the pregnancy status of these individuals and potentially their due date, if that's possible. Because remember, most of these individuals a lot of these individuals, half of them, the females at least, will be pregnant when they're trapped further north, but they don't really know they're pregnant yet, and neither do the trappers, and neither do we, because of that whole delayed implantation thing, right? So that whole process is very likely to get started once they get down here, and we want to know who's pregnant and who's not, as you might imagine. We also want to give them a chance while in that facility to just generally acclimate to Colorado, to recover from their travels, to make sure they're well nourished, to get them used to the food types and food sources that we have here in the state. And also start to think about which males and which females we might want to pair up, which ones we might want to avoid pairing up for the actual release into these places, especially being considerate of pregnant females. Infanticide is a thing with this species, so we don't want to put pregnant females, we don't want to put a male on top of a pregnant female. Because if those aren't his kits, he's potentially may try to kill those kits. So we want to avoid that. Obviously, that would be counterproductive. But also those that are pregnant, we're going to want to make sure that we definitely make sure that they're well nourished throughout the spring. We'll talk about that in a second. So the individuals can be released after sufficient amount of time at Frisco Creek. That'll probably vary from individual to individual, but somewhere between 3 and say 8 weeks or so. And the way we're going to do it, and I'll show you a map of this here in a second, is to release one female per 900 square kilometer release unit. Okay, so those release zones were those big 3 areas across the state. These units are much smaller segments within each of those zones. Put a female in each unit and then a male sort of released in between, kind of every 2 females, to sort of mimic again that natural sex ratio that we observe in nature, and also sort of how those territories work. So male territory is generally about twice as big as a female, and he sort of encompasses 2 of those with his territory. So we'll try to replicate that as best we can. Again, realizing that these animals are going to do whatever they want to do as soon as we release them. So we'll see how well the plan holds up here. It was the very strong opinion of all of the experts in that group that if we want to encourage Wolverines to stay in Colorado, because they can definitely up and move and cover a lot of ground in a hurry. If we want them to stay in Colorado and to survive well, especially those first few weeks after release, that we need to prepare a den for them so that they have a place that's already ready to go, that we can dump them straight into there with some food and sort of give them a head start. And hopefully they accept that. But also, they also thought it was very important that we provision these individuals regularly. So we do plan to drop carcasses with the individuals as we release them, and then every week or 2 weeks or whatever for several months after that. And again, that's to maximize their survival probability and also maximize the chances that they stay kind of where we put them. But then obviously we don't want to feed them their whole lives. We want to sort of wean them off of those carcasses as spring rolls around. So here's pictorially what that might look like. I zoomed into the central release zone. So we're looking in Leadville, Aspen, Crested Butte kind of area here. And you can see here's the broader release zone is everything in yellow. And within that, we have these groups of 300 square kilometer hexagons. These are the 900 square kilometer release units. So we might go female, 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 and drop a male kind of in between, that sort of a thing. We made the release units bigger than we think female home ranges would be for a couple of reasons. One, we don't know exactly how big female home ranges might be in Colorado. We may be vastly underestimating those. But also remember, some of these individuals will be pregnant. We hope most of them will get pregnant within a year or 2 if they're not already. And remember that female offspring like to set up home ranges next to mom. So we're releasing them in areas that are intentionally bigger than what we think their home range should be, to give room for those daughters to set up next to their mom and start to establish a population, is our thinking. When you do see the plan, you will notice there are lots of sections in there devoted to various conservation issues that we think are likely to come up as we do this. And I don't want to bore you and walk through all of those things here tonight, but I did want to just let you know that we've thought about a lot of things. And if you get a hold of that plan eventually and look at it, you'll see that there's sections in there about human caused mortality, what that looks like in other parts of the world, what we expect it to look like in Colorado, the effects of human disturbance in roads on wolverines, what we expect food availability to be like, effects of wolverines on other wildlife. Big one here, what we expect in terms of climate change and how we expect that to go relative to wolverines in the state. Livestock depredation is a huge issue, as you might imagine. Um, One thing that there's a lot of things that separate this restoration from wolves. Obviously, these species are very, very different and have very different ecological niches and operate differently on the landscape. But one of the big differences is livestock depredation. As I mentioned earlier, these are weasels, so they're much, much smaller than a wolf. They don't travel around in packs, and their preference is to just feed on stuff, on carrion, stuff that's already dead. So we do not expect livestock depredation to be a huge risk in terms of wolverine restoration. Not that it can't happen or won't happen from time to time. Sheep might be the most vulnerable thing, but even then, there are very, very few, um, just a small handful of wolverine depredation events ever recorded in North America for the last, say, 50 years or so. And then winter recreation and the effects of that is a big thing. Obviously, it's a huge industry in Colorado. It's a big economic driver. Lots of folks like to get out and do their thing, and that's great. But wolverines can tolerate some of that. They can't tolerate a ton of that, and so that may be an issue in certain places as well. The one thing that makes us feel good, makes us feel confident that we will be able to address those conservation issues and that this will work and work well is sort of encapsulated in this slide and the next slide. So the green crossed hash polygon here is again the modeled wolverine habitat. I've been showing you this whole presentation. And the colors you see underneath there are various types of public land. So most of this is green, that's Forest Service. Some of it is yellow, which is BLM. There's a little bit of blue, state land. But my main point here is that 94% of all the model wolverine habitat in Colorado occurs on public land. So right away, just because of that statistic, we expect that some of these conservation issues, some of the potential things, some of the things that we see with wolves in terms of them occupying lowland valleys, private land, ranches, a lot of that just goes away based on where wolverines will likely hang out and the human footprint in that area, which is relatively smaller. If we look at this in a different way, so there's the same green polygons underlying all of this color here, but that tan color is it's protected areas in Colorado. So these are federally designated wilderness areas, wilderness study areas, roadless areas, and what you see is there's an awful lot of tan over top of those green polygons. So about 70% of all modeled wolverine habitat in Colorado, not only is it public, but it's actually federally protected. So it's just another layer of a protection there and another layer of sort of insulation from sort of the human interaction dimensions, which we think will work in favor of wolverines. So anyway, those are all the potential conservation issues. Again, you can read about those if and when you download the plan. Those are the details as we see them now, written in paper on how we expect this reintroduction to unfold. But as I mentioned before, no one's tried this before, and I expect that if we are going to be successful, that there'll be a lot of pivoting and adjusting and readjusting from our plan as reality hits us and things actually unfold on the ground. There's probably a lot more that we don't know that we're not even aware of at the moment. What I did want to do is talk a little bit about Senate Bill 171. That was a piece of legislation that we worked hard all year on to get passed this last legislative session. And I will say one of the prouder things about that for us is it was sponsored in a bipartisan fashion. One Republican and one Democrat in the Senate were the ones who sort of brought this bill to the floor, and it received bipartisan support on the full votes of both the House and the Senate as well. So lots of people from both parties voted yes, and it passed quite easily. So that's certainly makes us happy, and hopefully we've done our due diligence to talk to all the stakeholders to address their concerns and to do this in a way that everyone is happy with, or at least not too mad about in the state. So what this does, real briefly, is it gives us authorization to reintroduce wolverines into Colorado. We have a state statute that requires us to do this because it's a listed species. You can't just go put a listed species out there without running that past the legislature. One of the big stipulations is it says that wolverines will not be translocated to Colorado until a 10J rule has been published that designates Colorado as an experimental, non-essential population. We'll talk more about what that is and why that's important in a second. That probably rings a bell if you've been following the wolf reintroduction stuff. That's been in the news a lot, but that's something we're actively working on right now, and that's a big step for us that needs to happen before any of this other stuff and any of the plan can be implemented. States that we will work cooperatively with the federal land management agencies. We will comply with all federal laws like NEPA. We will develop a plan for this reintroduction. I told you that's done. You'll see that hopefully soon. We will also develop a plan for communicating with interested parties, not only NGOs and other stakeholder groups, but also counties and county commissioners and various things like that. This is us trying to learn as much as we can from the wolf reintroduction thing. Try to have a better plan for making sure everyone is aware of what's happening, when it's happening, why, etc. And another big thing is the Parks and Wildlife Commission will adopt rules to allow for compensation of livestock losses. As I mentioned before, we really don't expect that to be a big deal. We expect livestock depredation to be very rare events due to wolverines, but we want to have some rules in place so that if and when it does happen, we can compensate folks fairly and quickly for those losses. So in a nutshell, that's what's in the bill. The biggest thing right now is this bullet number 2, which is this 10J thing. This has to do with reintroductions that occur into currently unoccupied habitat, which is exactly what we're doing. We're proposing to put wolverines, a federally listed species, into currently unoccupied habitat. It makes that population experimental, what's known as experimental, not essential. And in a nutshell, if you boil down all that legalese, what that does is reduces some of the regulatory conservation measures, but also the regulatory burden to various industries. Okay, so there's just a little less consultation that you have to go through in order to keep doing what you do. And there's sort of lower bars, higher bars that you have to meet in order to, have a finding that what you're doing is actually going to be considered take or adversely affect wolverines on the landscape. So we think this is a very good compromise. It allayed a lot of the fears and concerns of various stakeholder groups, especially the ski industry. And we do think that wolverines can thrive and do just fine with this designation. So I think it's a win-win, and we're working hard to get this done. It is a federal process. The Fish and Wildlife Service is the lead on that. We're working with them right now. They are about to find a contractor to start on the NEPA process. That is not a fast process. They are expecting to have a draft environmental assessment that you all will see and you all can comment on if you would like. They're hoping to have that done a year from now, so December of 25, and hoping to have a final designation in place by December of 26. If they're able to hold to that schedule, which oftentimes they're not, but if they were, then we could theoretically begin to move animals in, like, say, January of 27 would be the earliest that we could actually start executing that plan. Yep, and that's everything that I just mentioned. So Fish and Wildlife Service is the lead on that. It's going to require an environmental assessment, maybe even an EIS, and it's going to take, probably a couple of years to get us to the finish line there. But that'll be the big step and a critical step, and then we can start doing in my mind, the more interesting stuff. So I will stop there, and happy to try to answer any questions that any of you might have. And let me know if you want me to keep the presentation up, or do you want me to stop sharing that and close it down?
Jake, I think it's okay if you want to leave it up,
Okay,
just
sounds
in
great.
case
can-
there's any reference that you want to go back to.
Sure.
And I do see a couple of questions coming in. The first one is, with pika being a species of special concern and a non-hibernating animal, is there a concern of the non-hibernating wolverine overly depredating upon the pika during the winter months in a specific geographic area?
That's a good question. Again, I think that's one of those things that I won't say never that it couldn't happen, but that generally isn't a very big concern or something that we see much of in other places in North America where wolverine habitat or range overlaps with pikas. And the biggest thing there, we have some folks in our agency who spent a lot of years working on pikas, is yes, they're in the same general areas, but in the winter especially, pikas are tucked into all of that, all those tiny little crevices and those talus slopes, and then covered by feet and feet of snow on top of that. So the thinking is that they're pretty well protected from wolverines, and it would take an awful lot of work and an awful lot of calories for a wolverine to get down to a pika for, relatively little reward. So it just isn't something that they tend to engage in very often.
That's great. And I think that kind of covers this next question, which is what is the anticipated impact on pika's populations in Colorado?
Yeah, and again, we have some language about this in the plan, and that's one of those species that we sort of address, but then sort of dismisses that as far as we know, as far as the evidence we have from other places, we expect the impact to be pretty small on pikas. Yep.
Thank you, Jake. We have another question that came in that I think is interesting. So Karen said that she grew up fearing the wolverine. Did you or do you have to work on public perception of these animals?
Yeah, I think I don't know if we have to, but we certainly are going to. And that's part of the communications plan that we're putting together now, is not only how we're going to communicate to various stakeholders about what we're doing and when, but also just generally trying to educate the public a bit on, what the species really is, what it's about, how it operates. But yeah, I've gotten a number of those questions, do I have to be concerned, hiking with my kids in the Alpine if there's wolverines around? And the answer to that is probably not. Like, you'd be very lucky if you ever spot one from 500 yards away. But there's just, no, and literally no evidence from anywhere in the world of wolverines attacking humans or in pets and that kind of thing. So I don't think there's reason to worry on that front.
Great question. Good to know. The next question is, have you considered releasing sister wolverines in neighboring territories so they will have neighbors that they are comfortable with?
Yeah, we have. Well, that will depend a lot on sort of who we get to trap for us further north and the success that they have and that sort of thing. But we are going to try to keep track of, if we get multiple wolverines from the same trap line, say in Alberta or British Columbia, we're going to try to keep track of that, knowing that for some reason those individuals were living together up there. It makes sense to try to put them out, together in the same places, or juxtaposition wise down here as well, thinking that maybe they're related, they're at least, friendly or neighborly or whatever, and that might work out well. Yeah. So we'll try. We'll see how that goes.
Thank you, Jake. And we have at least, let's see, 3 more questions. And I do know that we are at 7:59. And so, Jake,
I
are
have
you
plenty
okay?
of time if you do, whatever you want to do.
Okay, so just in case anyone has to leave, I thought that I would present you at this time with a virtual check from the Open Space Foundation that we would like to present to Jake. And Jake is in turn, Jake, why don't you let everyone know where you are going to donate that, and then we can take a few more questions
Yeah,
that people might
so
have.
we decided we would donate that to GOCO, so Great Outdoors Colorado, which funds quite a lot of great stuff in Colorado, a lot of great, recreational places and opportunities, but has also funded a lot of our wildlife work over the years. So a lot of, maybe even the bulk of the funding for the Canada lynx restoration came through GOCO. We expect them to play a major role in, potentially at least, in funding Wolverine restoration as well. So that will certainly be helpful and much appreciated. So thank you for doing that.
Yes, and thank you, Jake, so much for being here. And if people want to stay, we'll go through a few more questions.
Sure.
So the next question came from Karen, and she asked if wolverines are nocturnal.
Are they nocturnal? Yeah, that's a great question, and it's a hard one to answer. They're not widely known as being, nocturnal like bats or something like that. They're not primarily nocturnal, no. They're primarily active during the day, but like a lot of species, that isn't to say that they're not active in the late evening, in the early morning, and sometimes, in the dead of night. So you certainly can be out and about at night, but I wouldn't categorize them necessarily as nocturnal.
So thank you, Jake. Kristen asked if you will be involved with on-the-ground monitoring and what is involved with that work.
Yeah, for sure, or at least I hope to be. And the monitoring will probably occur in phases, and it'll probably track sort of um, the same line as what happened with Canada Lynx. So as we're actively moving animals, translocating animals, and try to establish a population, a lot of our monitoring is going to be pretty intensive and based on those GPS collars and keeping track of animals on a pretty tight schedule so that we can do things like estimate their survival probability. We can find dens and estimate their productivity on an annual basis. We can make sure that they're showing some fidelity to Colorado. We can look at habitat selection and how big their home ranges are and just learn about how they act here. All of that sort of feeds into these population models that helps us to decide whether or not the population is viable or stable, and have we met our goals in terms of establishing a population. Once we feel like we've achieved that, then we will probably pull back from all of the collaring and the trapping and the intensive monitoring, sort of let them be wolverines from then on, and try to monitor our investment there in more non-invasive fashion. So right now with lynx, we monitor them every year, but we monitor them via snow tracking surveys. We put out a lot of remote game cameras to collect pictures and that sort of thing. So I think that's, kind of what we anticipate the monitoring will look like for wolverines. Intensive for a while until we feel like we, quote unquote, did it in terms of establishing a population, and then less intensive, non-invasive after that.
Great, thank you.
Mhm.
So a couple more questions have come in. Mike said, great presentation. Any plans to update the 2013 habitat model based on the changes you mentioned?
Yeah, that's a great question. We've talked a bit about that. It's hard to do. So that habitat model was based on having lots of locations, GPS locations on samples of wolverines in the Northern Rockies. You build a model based on what they like, and you spray that to other parts of the world. So what we don't have right now is a lot of collared wolverines to build a new model with, and especially collared wolverines that are living in places that weren't burned and then now are burned, for example. So we can, if we wanted to say, well, maybe we could take these burned areas out, but that's sort of us in a bit of conjecture as to whether that's really true or not. I think what we will try to do is once we reintroduce animals and follow them around, we can build our own habitat model specifically for the Southern Rockies and go from there. It's probably the best that we can do. It would be nice if we had a way to update the 2013 stuff. There's just not a great objective way to do that at the moment.
Thanks, Jake.
Mhm.
And so the next question comes from Martin. he says, thanks for your informative presentation. Glad there's a pathway for wolverines to be introduced here in Colorado. Could you talk briefly about the different challenges as far as reintroduction of different predator native species like wolves, wolverines, and hopefully someday grizzlies?
Yeah.
And he also says, wondering about the possibility this year of a documented buckeye kill.
Yeah, we'll see. I don't know what the probability of that is for in a few weeks, but yeah, that's a really good question. Yeah, it's almost overwhelming to think about the challenges with reintroducing predators. There's a number of biological challenges. A lot of those I just talked about. The overriding challenge of all of this is just the unknown because no one's ever done it, so we don't know how it's going to work. So, there's this huge elephant in the room of doing something for the first time is a huge challenge. But then all of the other things we talked about, how is it going to interface with winter recreation? Is that going to be okay? How is it going to work out with livestock depredation? Is that going to be, okay? And then there's the other, huge challenge of just socially, how is that going to go in various, rural communities on the West Slope? How is it going to be accepted in other places? There's a lot of work to do and a lot of potential, pitfalls for us to work through. So, yeah, I think the list of challenges is really, really, really long. We'll just have to pick them off one at a time as they come and hope we can do a decent job.
Thanks, Jake. And I'm hoping that we have time for one more question, which came in, which is, what is the population of wolverines in Alaska and Canada?
Yeah, that's a really good question. We don't have a great answer to that. It's the last time anyone tried to estimate that was a very back of the envelope estimate, probably pretty rough. And it was in the tens of thousands kind of range, like 10 to 15, 10 to 20,000, something like that. It's variable. Some places in some of those provinces have recently closed trapping seasons because they're worried about their local populations. Other places, they're still trapping hundreds of wolverines per year in various regions of all of these provinces. So I do think it's a much more robust population, obviously, than we have in the lower 48. And we do think it's robust enough, especially since they're still legally trapped, to support, what we think is a fairly minimal effort on our part. Hopefully they can sustain us pulling 45 of, their 10,000, and that's not going to hurt anything too badly up there.
That's great. Thank you for answering all these great questions, and thank you participants for asking all these great questions. It was so interesting.
Great. Yeah, lots of good questions.
Thank you, Jake. I wanted to let our attendees know that this is the last presentation for this season, and we are planning 2 presentations for the kind of winter springtime in February. We'll be having a nature photographer on February 12th, and then we're looking at a date in March for Great Outdoors Colorado to come and speak about their work and their goals and what they're trying to do for our state. So that's very nice of you to donate to them.
Yeah, no, that works
The
out
circle
great.
comes around again, you know what I mean?
Yeah, exactly. It's a small world. Yep.
And thank you, Jake. Thank you, Tara and Maddie, very much for your help tonight. Good evening, everyone.
Yep.
Stay
Thank
well.
you. Thanks,
Yep.
Jake.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you, Chris.